Joining me here today in the CNBC Sanctuary. Hugh, we've spoken before. Nomzamo, this is the first time I've met you, but the third time you've come to Davos. Why is it important for you to be here?
Well, I think we need to continue to engage different people from all corners of this wonderful planet that we get to occupy. I think it would be remiss to not include entertainers, people who use their voice for good. When it comes to the World Economic Forum, it cannot just be about policy. It cannot just be about governments. It cannot just be about private sector. We have to be able to involve the people who amplify those kinds of messages. And I suppose that's why I continue to come here, to solidify the voice of the voiceless.
Hugh, of course, the theme is rebuilding trust. From global citizens' point of view, is that something that's ever going to be achievable?
I think, well, our approach at Global Citizen has always been about trust comes through the empowerment of citizens. Citizens have to exercise their voice en masse, and that's why we're a movement of 12 million members around the world who've now taken over 34 million actions, calling on world leaders to commit over $43 billion that's been announced on Global Citizen stages over the last 10 years. And I think we're at this critical moment where people see a fractured world. They see a world with increasing conflict, increasing economic instability. And in this context, things like the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals can feel so esoteric. We believe our job is to focus on the practical and give citizens the power to create change. And that's why every year, this year, for example, the past year in 2023, we mobilized a campaign calling on the World Bank to issue what were called debt pause clauses to enable the world's poorest nations to become more climate resilient. And we achieved a goal of having Ajay Banga, the new president of the World Bank, make his first public announcement on our stage in Paris in front of the Eiffel Tower and 25,000 of our members there. That's where you see citizens seeing their actions leading to real-world results and rebuilding the trust that you're talking about.
So what is your message here to the world leaders from the citizens?
Well, we believe ultimately we need to prioritize a couple of key things. Firstly, we need to prioritize global food security so that smallhold agricultural farmers are not left behind. Secondly, we need to make sure that the promises that came out of the COP agreement at the end of last year are actually operationalized, which was leading to mass decarbonization and a fossil fuel future where we actually get rid of fossil fuels and transition to clean energy. And you would have seen the great news that across Europe now, they're powered by more wind energy than they are by coal energy, which is a huge breakthrough this past week. But we're also focused very heavily on really making sure that the African continent, which is where Global Citizen has a huge number of members, that their voices are lifted up. That's why today and tomorrow we're launching our Move Africa initiative, which I'm happy to tell you more about.
Tell me about it. Thank you, Hugh. Yes. We'd love to hear about Move Africa, your new initiative.
Well, Nomzamo and I can both share with you. Why don't you kick it off?
Well, I suppose we as the organization, we continue to want to amplify the message of Africa and what it has to offer, that it's not just rich in natural resources, but it's rich in its people, right? And what does that mean? It means that there's undeveloped skill set there. But the global community is able to come through and give those skill sets and pass on those skills development. And I think that's what we want to do with Move Africa. But of course, we want to do it through the power of music, the power of the arts, and galvanizing ordinary citizens who continue to hold the policymakers and governments accountable for the promises that they've made to them.
And to build off what Nomzamo is saying, when Nomzamo talked about the power of music and power of citizens, often if you're a huge artist like a Beyonce or a Rihanna and you launch a world tour, you go to North America, you go to Latin America, you go to Europe, but largely you skip Africa. Mm-hmm. Why? Because of a lack of infrastructure. So we've made ourselves the commitment over the next 5 years. We're going to form public-private partnerships with the right nation states in North, South, East and West Africa, focused on creating the world's first ever international touring circuit so that artists don't skip Africa, but they make it their priority. We kicked it off with Kendrick Lamar in Rwanda with 10,000 of our members, and we're going to scale it up this year with a huge announcement on that tomorrow.
What has the response been so far, Hugh? How optimistic are you?
Unbelievable.
Oh, it's amazing.
Unbelievable. I mean, we take it back to Mandela 100, and we had about 70 to 80,000 people in a stadium
And can I tell you, when I was in Rwanda, seeing Kendrick Lamar, a kid from Compton, as he called himself, on stage in Rwanda, his first ever performance in Africa. And he put a map of Africa behind him with the words Compton over it. Like, he really got the message. And then I was sitting next to some local rappers. And rappers in Rwanda, they have their shit together, pardon me. But they were in tears. They were so moved by the experience. This is how much it meant to them, that this is the first time their hero, one of the greatest artists that both Taylor Swift and Beyonce admire, had come all the way to Rwanda to perform at the highest quality of production.
Are you hopeful that other artists like Beyonce will follow suit, though?
I have no doubt they will. You know, Global Citizen has had the privilege of working with the world's greatest artists. Beyonce has performed on stage 3 times at Global Citizen. Rihanna has performed several times, as well as coming with us to Senegal to focus on the issue of girls' education and help with the GPE replenishment. I have zero doubt that as we scale this up, that the world's greatest artists will all follow alongside Kendrick Lamar and take this to scale. It's because many of the most prominent artists have strong origins on the continent. They trace their origins back to the continent, and they want to tell that story.
Nomzamo, can I ask you about your own story? Where did this passion to make a difference come from? And why did you choose Global Citizen?
I think we chose each other.
That's true.
Look, when I was 14 years old, the first time I ever left South Africa was to go to Kenya. I had been invited, or I suppose selected, to go and represent my country, and would join a group of kids from all over the continent. It was with Save the Children. It was the very first time that I got to see kids from South Sudan, kids from Burundi, kids from the Congo, and to experience something that was outside of my physical borders. I knew that I would be in advocacy work. I knew that I would be able to be a person one day who wants to stand up for something that was much greater than myself. It then happened that I went into the public space of being a public figure of film and television, and I knew that I wanted to be able to use my platform for something much better than somebody coming to my Instagram and looking for what I'm wearing that day. You know, I think what people know about me and associate with me is that if I go to Nomzamo's page, she's definitely speaking about something in bettering humanity, in standing up for young women and young girls, in education as well. But also, most importantly, as my work with the UN Refugee Agency is to make sure that women no longer are weapons of war and weapons of conflict. For so long we see it. And of course now with the food security crisis that we face, there's what we call sextortion that's happening in Kenya today, where young women cannot get access to water without having to be sexually abused, a basic human right. So for me, as a young girl who was 14 years old, being exposed to young girls who had to go through female genitalia mutilation, fast track to a 34-year-old sitting today and having to hear stories of young women in Kenya experiencing sextortion means the work is never, ever done. And so I lean on to my Global Citizen family for us to be able to continue to galvanize private sector, to continue to galvanize, in fact, the global community, to say we cannot continue to operate in silos. We are much more connected. We are much, much more connected.
When you talk to world leaders here, though, what is your message to them? When you tell us these stories, how can these challenges be overcome on a governmental level? Not just a cultural.
You know, Tania, I think there's a mistake of numbers. We love to throw around numbers so much. It's 1 in 2 million. It's 1 in 800,000. No, it's 1 Sam apple 2 million times. So when you change that narrative where a person is not a number, is not a statistic, it is an identity. That is a young girl, that is a young boy who has no business being exposed to such human immorality in 2024, not when we come to the World Economic Forum and we're speaking about 35 billion rands towards AI. it's just completely unfair.
What are your conversations around these kinds of issues, Hugh, here?
Well, I think that what we're finding that some governments, as well as the private sector, really want to be partners in this endeavor. We're fortunate to work with many of the world's Fortune 100 companies as backers of Global Citizen because they believe in our mission. Whether it's great companies like Cisco or Verizon that have really stepped up to support our mission consistently over so many years. And we don't work with them generally, we work with them specifically on issues like the digital divide. We work with them on specific issues like how do you make sure that kids have access to quality education globally. We target very specific policy issues that they care about and that we care about and our movement cares about. As it relates to world leaders, I think it's very much a mixed bag. Some world leaders can be your partners, and we're very proud to have formed a 5-year partnership with the Rwandan government. Yeah. And we have a big announcement tomorrow vis-a-vis Move Africa that we're super excited about. And then you also find that other leaders, you need to nudge further. You need to encourage them to do the right thing because they're slower to act or they're not leveraging the full suite of tools they have in their toolbox to take action. And that's where Global Citizen comes in. I think that what we've seen consistently is that usually political leaders, if you give them a very clear opportunity to use their tools to make a difference, and they see that millions of members are calling on them in unison, they tend to respond, but you have to nudge them. And so that's where we're lucky to have 12 million members around the world who, when Nomzamo and other great artists speak out, our members will proudly take action in unison and use their collective voice to force the right sort of change to happen.
Hugh, when you first started Global Citizen, could you ever have imagined this kind of success?
Well, I mean, it's funny because when we first started, we were trying to get to year 2. We were
12 million members.
We were a startup in the truest sense of the word. I'll never ever forget. We had a tiny office on Lafayette Street in New York, and in year 1, when we held our first concert on the Great Lawn of Central Park, everyone said it's impossible because no one had done it since Simon and Garfunkel back in 1981. Yeah. And they said, you're not going to pull this off. And Mayor Bloomberg was like, okay, you can have the Great Lawn, but you have to convince the artist to perform for free. And I'll never, ever forget that year. We already had the Foo Fighters confirmed, but they didn't want a headline because it was too intimidating to have 60,000 people on the Great Lawn.
Oh, my goodness.
I know. And so they said to me, you have to convince another artist to go with us. And I'll never forget, we were literally August, and the concerts every year in September during the UN General Assembly meeting. And I was over in LA, and we were still $1 million short of pulling it off. And that day, I'll never forget it. It was a bit of a miracle. I sat down with Sumner Redstone, and he wrote a check for $1 million on the spot. Wow. And then an hour later, I got a call from Neil Young, who called me from Hawaii, and he said, Hugh, I want to headline your first show in Central Park. And I was like, oh my goodness. And then a month later, 60,000 of our members arrived on the Great Lawn. We raised $1 billion that night for poverty alleviation around the world. And I thought that was, honestly, I thought, okay, I'm going to go back to Australia. That's well done. But then the next day I got a call from Stevie Wonder.
Oh,
who said,
as you do.
No, trust me, I didn't expect this one either. And he said, Hugh, I want to headline year 2. And I said, well, Mr. Wonder, with all respect, there is no year 2. And he said, well, Hugh, there is now. Oh. And so that's where Global Citizen got its momentum. And then when Chris Martin from Coldplay signed on to help us curate around the world, and as Nomzamo said, took it to India with Jay-Z, and then to South Africa with Beyonce, and then now, 12 years later, we've been all around the world and have grown to become the largest movement of citizens taking action for the end of extreme poverty. It's been an amazing ride, and I'm thankful every day for the work we get to do.
Yeah.
Hugh, are you worried, though, sometimes? I mean, of course, here, the geopolitical conflicts, the economic headwinds. Do you think food insecurity goes down the agenda?
Absolutely. I mean, it's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. When people don't feel like they have their basic needs met, when they don't feel safe and secure, when they don't feel like they have job security because of an unstable economic environment, then people tend not to be as altruistic. They're like, okay, well, how can I care about other people on the other side of the planet? But when you explain to people, and I love what the ethicist Peter Singer said, The Life You Can Save, because he talked about this idea that actually the tyranny of distance isn't as distant as we like to think it is, because Take, for example, COVID. It started, let's say, in China, and it ended up in the United States overnight. It's not like the world isn't completely interconnected anymore. All of the issues we face, whether it's the global refugee crisis, economic insecurity, global health and pandemics, these are all global issues. So if we don't take a global perspective, the issues will hit us on the face whether we like it or not. So my perspective is invest in the root cause of the problem, which in some cases is health insecurity, which in some cases is averting the refugee crisis. People don't want to leave their home. They only leave their home if they're forced to. We've got to remember that. And that's why we need to actually make sure that we're addressing the root causes. And I think that I would call that for everyone our enlightened self-interest. So even when it's hard to think about other people on other parts of the planet, it's ultimately in all of our interest to care.
Nomzamo, you also have your own foundation, the Lighthouse Foundation, that you launched in 2015. Tell us about that.
The Lighthouse Foundation supports young people across South Africa who are in debt from student funding, and also for STEM students that need funding to go in and further their studies for STEM. We saw a very huge, I suppose, gap in terms of the education or quality education when it comes to STEM. And it's important because, number one, we live in the fourth industrial revolution, so we want to make sure that African students are also just as equal participation in the space.
And what kind of equality are you seeing in your home nation? Because there's been a huge disparity.
Huge disparity, but you know, as like Hugh, I like to look at the positivity side of things, and we've seen a lot of headway and a lot of successes. A lot of young people are now wanting better for their lives. For as long as we do good, for as long as we stand in the gap, and we lift the lid of invisibility when it comes to our policymakers, of course, governments who prioritize corruption instead of prioritizing, the needs of its people. We have to make sure that we reach out to our networks. For me, it's very important with the different organizations, and particularly private sector, that I have access to as a public figure, whether I'm an ambassador for it, whether I'm a spokesmodel for it. Each one of them that I have a contract with has something to contribute towards not only the Lighthouse Foundation, but every other cause that I believe in. For example, with Cotton On Foundation, we've built 2 schools now, schools that were built in 1940s. Per se, and were never refurbished, were never renovated, so have really been run down. But we see that with the renovation of a school, the amount of pride, that motivation that it kind of brings back to students to come to school, to take their education seriously. And of course, there's other programs that we make sure we implement in the schools. We don't want it to just be a learning facility. We want them to be able to see that there's opportunities outside of the impoverished areas that they're growing up in.
What would you call on your government to do?
Oh. Are you sure you want to ask me that? Put your people first. Put your people first. I think if my government particularly, or perhaps the government across the African continent, put its people first, I don't think we would be facing the energy crisis that South Africa is facing currently, which hinders so much. It affects people who are in private sector, the ordinary workers, but it also affects students as well. If you don't have electricity, how are you supposed to be studying at school, right? And so for us, it's really just seeing how gross it's become when not putting national interest first.
How frustrating is it for you when you travel the world and then you go back home?
Extremely frustrating. Extremely. I always say to people, South Africa is the most beautiful, beautiful country in the world. It is just sad that we experience what we experience. I was in Singapore recently, and I just said to myself, I was like, I wish I could take this entire country and just give it to my people. How efficient, how clean, how forward-thinking, how intentional the government is there about what kind of nation they want to build, what kind of world they want to build. And so for me, it's really just thinking to myself, and I implore young people as well on the African continent that there is no glory in you wanting to seek greener pastures. Seek greener pastures, but come back and water the very pastures that raised you. Because the one thing that we really do have on the continent is incredible working capital, number one, but also very skilled young people who are leaving at exponential rates, who are seeking opportunities overseas, who are being poached by big companies to come in and obviously, grow their entities overseas, but no one's coming back. And I think there's a dying phenomenon, and it's something that is really brewing, and for as long as we don't address it, we'll wake up one day and we will be very short of this wonderful resources that we say are our people.
What kind of impact does having Nomzamo as an ambassador for Global Citizen, how important is it for you to have her?
It's critically important. I think Nomzamo has been a true thought partner for the organization for so many years now. I remember during the pandemic, Nomzamo worked with us to bring the first ever concert to SoFi Stadium. We had that night the Foo Fighters, we had J-Lo, we had Prince Harry and Meghan were there, and Nomzamo hosted the entire thing. And this was the first ever concert, and we actually got 26 million vaccine doses committed to emerging markets that night. And I think that's an example of where Nomzamo's leadership has been so consistent over so many years. And I think Nomzamo, as one of our ambassadors, has also been critical to our work in South Africa. So when that year, during Mandela 100, when we took Global Citizen to FNB Stadium, Nomzamo was the host alongside Trevor Noah. And then when everyone from that night, I remember Pharrell, Oprah Winfrey, Dave Chappelle, Usher, Beyonce, Jay-Z, Coldplay, you name it, everyone was there that night. But Nomzamo really carried the spirit throughout the entire night of showing South African pride, as well as pride for being a global citizen.
Thanks, Hugh. I paid him to say that, by the way.
I thought so. he did it right on cue. Nomzamo, you have a very successful acting career as well. Tell us about some of your projects.
Oh, my little projects. Started acting a couple of years ago. I'd probably say in 2013?
Not too long ago.
Yes, 2013, on a local soapie. I had just been studying at the University of Cape Town. I was getting my bachelor's degree in accounting, and I just knew that it wouldn't be what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. And even when my career took off in South Africa, and I played spokesmodel and ambassador for different brands, but also continued to be a household name in the television space, I wanted more. And so in 2019, I made the big leap of faith and I went to Hollywood. And just before I gave up, I got the call, which said, hey, you got the role for Coming to America. You get to star alongside Eddie Murphy, somebody that we all grew up loving and adoring. And so that was my big break into the Hollywood scene. And so it's just really continuing in that space. But now I'm wearing the hat of producer. I got to executive produce my very first show, which is an epic. It is dubbed the Game of Thrones of Africa, and the rest of the world will see it very soon once we get our international distribution. So that's my world outside. That's the glamorous side. But I'm more passionate about speaking about things that my heart really has a north compass to, which is my humanitarian work. I come alive, I expand when I speak about it, because I just know that the difference that we're making in terms of really tapping into the different networks. And I think Hugh and the rest of the Global Citizen team continue to just be foot soldiers. It is amazing to watch them work, and I'm so inspired by it. And I continue to just learn and absorb as well the skill set, but also the strategy when it comes to what it is and how clear the intent is when it comes to the messaging and the growth of Global Citizen. But yes, I lead a very glamorous life outside of all of that.
You also starred in Assassin, is that right? The blockbuster.
I did. Bruce Willis's final film. It was an incredible experience working with him. He still has, had that Bruce charm and that smirk. I remember one time he came on to set, he said, "Hello, short one." I said, "Hello, tall one." But he was wonderful, and and we wish him well. I wish him all the very best, and he's surrounded by love, and it's incredible to be a part of a legacy of somebody who grew Hollywood to become these blockbuster pursuing kind of studio formulae, and to be able to star in his final film is something that I hold dear.
Of course. And Hugh, you were talking before, of course, about global cooperation, Global Citizen. How worried are you, though, about governments becoming more nationalistic and leaning in?
I mean, I think ultimately, as I said earlier, I think that our entire philosophy is predicated on the idea that all of the issues we face as humanity truly are global issues. And that actually, if we try to erect false borders or try to act as though a man is an island unto itself, it's just a fallacy. It doesn't really apply. Global diseases don't respect national borders. Currency doesn't respect national borders. So why do we act as though we can simply throw other people out while prosper ourselves? I think increasingly those that are wising up to it, including even the elite here in Davos, realize that they can't hide from the rest of the world, and they have to act altruistically. It's why I love what people like Chris Anderson from TED have done in creating Audacious Ideas, where he's encouraged the world's wealthiest billionaires to commit billions of dollars to tackle the world's greatest challenges. So yes, politically, we are seeing pockets of nationalism emerge, and we can't ignore that. But we also need to remember that politics is a pendulum. It's always going to swing back. And as MLK said, we want it to swing and bend towards justice. And that's what we're fighting for. It's justice and equity.
Can I just ask you for your final message? What action do you want to see from the World Economic Forum, both of you?
What action? Head on over to globalcitizen.org. We've got all the actions for you.
That's a good one. I would love to see, I'd like to start with the World Bank. They're currently still financing fossil fuels greater than they are renewables. I'd like to see them divest from all of their fossil fuels and focus on renewables, because we've already seen now in Europe that renewables can surpass fossil fuels as a sustainable energy source. It's not as though the world is going to run out of energy. We've got enough wind, enough solar. I come from Australia where there's far too much sunshine. So we actually, if we invest, we see the return on investment. So I'd like to see RJ Banga make that leap this year.
Thank you very much, Hugh Nomzamo. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you.